Deep within a cold, obsidian heart lies a secret that has been protected for an entire lifetime. We break through the hard exterior to find the warmth of humanity that still beats within. Hit subscribe now and discover the mysteries hidden in the dark corners of the soul.
Day my uncle told me I had no claim to my grandfather's company, I was standing in the kitchen eating leftover pasta out of a Tupperware container, still in my work clothes at 8:30 at night. He said it like it was nothing, like he was telling me the weather. You understand, sweetheart. The business stays in the family. You're just the granddaughter. I was 31 years old. I had a master's degree in accounting and 4 years of experience running internal audits for a mid-sized manufacturing firm. But sure, just the granddaughter. My grandfather, Wendell, built Harmon Tile and Stone from a single warehouse in 1979. He started with nothing. No investors, no loans his father co-signed, no inherited land. Just him, a second-hand van, and a contact list he'd built over 15 years of working other people's floors. By the time I was born, he had 3 distribution centers and contracts with commercial builders across 6 states. He was the kind of man who remembered every employee's birthday and kept a paper ledger even after everyone else moved to software. Because he said he didn't trust numbers he couldn't touch. He taught me that. He used to let me sit at his desk on Saturday mornings when I was little, tracing the columns in his ledger with my finger while he explained what each line meant. Every dollar tells a story, he'd say. You just have to learn how to read it. My grandmother passed when I was 12. After that, Grandpa spent more time at the office than anywhere else. My mother, his only daughter, would bring him dinner twice a week. I'd come with her sometimes. I liked the smell of the place, the warm concrete and the faint chemical bite of the sealant samples in the back room. My uncle, my grandfather's only son, managed the day-to-day after Grandpa's health started declining around 2019. His wife, who I'll just call my aunt by marriage, had worked in commercial real estate before they met. She was sharp. I'll give her that. She just happened to use that sharpness entirely in service of herself. My mother and I weren't involved in the business operations. My grandfather had set it up so that the ownership interest was split, 60% to his son, 40% divided equally between his 2 children, my mother and my uncle. But my mother had signed her shares over to a family trust years ago, back when Grandpa had suggested it as an estate planning move. The understanding was that the trust would pass proportionally to the next generation. To me, nobody ever sat me down and explained the details. I was 22 when the trust was created. I was in grad school, and I didn't ask questions I probably should have asked. That's on me. I know that. But here's what I didn't know. Somewhere between the trust being created and my grandfather's decline, my uncle had restructured things. Quietly. On paper, it looked like an administrative update, a consolidation they'd called it. My aunt had drafted the language. My uncle had signed. My grandfather, by that point, was 81 and trusting his son to handle the details. I didn't know any of this in March when I drove up for Grandpa's 83rd birthday dinner. It was a Sunday. Cold for March, the kind of damp cold that gets into your joints. My mother and I drove up together, stopping at a gas station for coffee, because neither of us had slept well. She'd been worried about him. He'd had a fall in January, nothing broken, but it rattled her. He'd always seemed so permanent to her. To both of us. The dinner was at my uncle's house, not Grandpa's. That was the first thing that felt slightly off to me, though I didn't say anything. Grandpa's house was 15 minutes away. He had a dining room table that seated 12, but my aunt had offered to host, and apparently that was that. The house was loud when we got there. My uncle's 2 grown sons were there with their families, and the kitchen smelled like catered food, which it was. My aunt didn't cook, which, fine, neither do I, but she'd ordered from a restaurant that charged $35 a plate and made sure to mention it twice. My grandfather sat in the living room in an armchair, smaller than I remembered. He smiled when I came in and reached for my hand and held it for a second longer than usual. There she is, he said. My accountant? He always called me that. It used to embarrass me. That night it made my throat tight. Dinner was fine, loud and fine. My aunt directed most of the conversation toward her son's accomplishments. One was launching a food business. One had apparently made some very smart moves in a private investment. My uncle nodded along to everything. My mother and I ate and smiled and answered when spoken to. After dessert, while everyone was having coffee, my uncle pulled me aside. He took me into his study. Walnut paneling, oil paintings of horses, the whole thing. and sat behind his desk like he was about to deliver a performance review. I sat across from him in a chair that was slightly too low, which I don't think was an accident. He told me that the family had decided to restructure the trust. He said it in smooth, practiced sentences. The business needed to consolidate its ownership to secure better financing. The trust my mother had established was being folded into the general ownership structure. My shares, the ones that were supposed to come to me, had been reclassified. Reclassified, I said. It was necessary for the financing arrangement, he said. You understand how these things work. I did understand how these things work. That was the problem. Who signed off on this? I asked. Your grandfather reviewed everything. I'd like to see the documents. He smiled. The kind of smile that's actually a door closing. Of course. We can set something up. I'll have our attorney reach out. That was 8 months ago. The attorney never reached out. I want to be clear about something. I didn't go looking for a fight. I went back to my apartment and I waited. I called my mother and told her what had happened, and she went quiet in that particular way she has when she already half knew something was wrong. I gave my uncle the benefit of the doubt. I told myself there might be a legitimate explanation. I know how complicated business restructuring can get. I know that paperwork moves slowly. I know a lot of things. But I also know what a stall looks like. I've seen it in audits. Someone stops returning calls. Follow-up emails get one-line responses. We'll circle back. Our attorney is reviewing. Let's set up a time next month. Next month becomes 3 months and then 6, and then you realize you've been managed. In October, I got a new client at work, a regional building supply company. Routine audit, nothing dramatic. I was reviewing their vendor agreements when I noticed they sourced tile from Harmon Tile and Stone, specifically from a subsidiary I'd never heard of, Harmon Consolidated LLC, registered 18 months ago. I sat with that for a minute. Then I started pulling threads. It took me 3 weeks, working evenings and weekends, cross-referencing public filings, tax records, and the documents my grandfather had given me copies of years ago. Just so you have them. He'd handed me a folder at Christmas one year, said, hold on to these. You never know. I'd kept them in a fireproof box in my closet without ever really looking at them. I looked at them now. What I found was this. When my uncle created Harmon Consolidated LLC, he transferred the core revenue-generating assets of the original company into it. The original Harmon Tile and Stone entity was still technically active but had been stripped of its contracts, its equipment leases, its distribution agreements. On paper, the original company was nearly worthless. My shares, which were in the original company, were nearly worthless. My uncle's ownership interest had been migrated to the new LLC, along with everything that made the business valuable. It was neat. I'll give him that. If you didn't know what you were looking at, it looked like a routine corporate restructuring. If you did know what you were looking at, it looked like a man who'd spent 18 months making sure his niece's inheritance would amount to nothing. There's a phrase in accounting, figures don't lie, but liars figure. My grandfather said it to me once. I think he'd be sad to know how relevant it turned out to be. I called an attorney in November. Not just any attorney. I asked around, talked to 3 different people I trusted, and ended up with a woman who specialized in business litigation and had handled a handful of trust disputes. She looked at everything I'd put together and was quiet for a long moment. How long did this take you? She asked. About 3 weeks of evenings. She looked at me over her glasses. You do this for a living. Internal audits, yeah. And they knew that about you. Yes. She shook her head slowly. Not at me. At them. We filed in December. I didn't tell my uncle. I didn't tell my aunt. I didn't even tell my mother until the filing was done, because I knew she'd worry, and I didn't want her to talk me out of anything or into anything. I just needed to do it cleanly. My grandfather found out in January. I was terrified of that conversation. I drove to his house on a Tuesday afternoon, sat with him at his kitchen table, the same table where he'd gone over his ledgers every Saturday morning for 40 years, and told him what I'd found. He listened without interrupting. That was always his way. He let you finish. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment. He looked out the window at his backyard, at the bare January trees. I wondered, he said finally. You wondered. I'm old, not blind. He turned back to me. I signed things I shouldn't have signed without reading them well enough. That's my mistake. I was tired and I trusted him and I made a mistake. I didn't know what to say to that. I reached across the table and covered his hand with mine. I'm not doing this to blow up the family, I said. I know that. He patted my hand once. You're doing this because it's right, and because you know how to read a ledger. He smiled a little when he said it. That got me. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. The case moved through the early stages faster than my attorney expected. Part of that was because my documentation was thorough. She said so more than once, with a kind of professional satisfaction that I recognized from my own work. When you do it right, it shows. Part of it was also because my uncle, when confronted with specific filings and specific evidence, apparently didn't have as clean an explanation as he thought he would. His attorney made a counter-argument about business necessity and agreed upon restructuring. My attorney made a more specific argument about fiduciary duty, the terms of the original trust, and the timeline of the LLC formation relative to my inquiry about the documents. The timeline was damning. Harmon Consolidated had been registered 6 weeks after I sat in my uncle's study and asked to see the paperwork. 6 weeks. My aunt, I later found out, had been the one to draft the original restructuring documents. She'd done it herself rather than go through the company's usual outside counsel, which my attorney described to me as a telling choice. There were 2 more months of filings, responses, a deposition I gave in a conference room in February, 3 hours of questions I answered as clearly and specifically as I could, because clarity is what I know how to do. My uncle's deposition, from what I heard through my attorney, was somewhat less clear. In March, 2 years to the month from Grandpa's birthday dinner, we reached a settlement. I'm not going to share every detail because some of it is still subject to confidentiality. What I can tell you is that my ownership interest was restored, not the stripped shell of the original entity, the actual interest in the operating business, with valuation based on the revenue that had been migrated to Harmon Consolidated. There were also terms related to back distributions, the profits that had been generated during the period my interest was being suppressed. It was a significant number. I'm still getting used to it, honestly. My uncle and I have not spoken since December when his attorney sent a letter suggesting I was acting in bad faith. I kept that letter. I read it once and then put it in the same fireproof box where I kept my grandfather's documents. My aunt sent my mother a text message in April saying she hoped the family could move forward. My mother did not respond. I had dinner with my grandfather last week. Just the 2 of us at his kitchen table. I brought soup from the deli he likes, and he made instant coffee, which I've been drinking with him since I was a kid, even though I think instant coffee is genuinely bad. We sat there for 2 hours. He told me about a job he did in 1983, laying travertine in a hotel lobby, how he'd had to redo a section 3 times to get the pattern right. He said the hotel is still there. He drove past it sometimes. You want to see it? He asked. Yeah, I said. I really do. He smiled, reached across, and patted my hand the same way he had in January. Good, he said. We'll go. I don't have a tidy moral for this. I'm not going to tell you that everything happens for a reason or that family always comes around or that justice is guaranteed. It's not. I got lucky in some ways, lucky that I had the skills, lucky that Grandpa had given me copies of those documents years ago without either of us knowing why, lucky that I found a good attorney and that the evidence was clear. But I also want to say this. If you're the person in your family that everyone assumes won't fight back, the one who's too polite, too accommodating, too busy, too young, too whatever, pay attention to that. Because sometimes the reason they assume you won't fight back is the exact same reason they underestimated what happens when you do. I'm still just the granddaughter, but I'm the granddaughter who knows how to read a ledger. And it turns out, so did he.